This guy's the bomb, right?
And are you guys in the same?
Yeah, so our desk is right next to each other.
Saturday and here or Sunday. But our expert people are really good. They all work on the weekend and gave us reviews. Yeah. Yeah. But which gives me a lot of edits.
Project Confluence, which is a program it's in the focus on getting scientists and
Good morning, folks. Let's get started. Welcome to the Arizona State University Embassy. We hope you all have your passports. And welcome as well to yet another in an infinitely long series of policy breakfast seminars. So I'm Dan Sarowitz with the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes. And some of you are new here, so the drill is the following. We will hear from our speaker, who I'll introduce briefly in a second. He will hopefully provoke and inspire you. He will give a short talk, half an hour or less, and then we'll open up to conversation. The immediate goal here is to engage the ideas that Darshan will present. The longer term goal is we're trying to build a network in the Beltway of and beyond, but of people who are interested and engaged in the process of thinking about science, technology, and innovation in new ways that are directly connected to solving the many problems that society faces today. So kind of a different, more engaged way of thinking and talking about and acting on the capacity of government and civil society to mobilize science technology for human betterment. So today I'm especially thrilled to have my friend and colleague Darshan Karwat here. What I love to say about Darshan, because somehow the words trip off my tongue so pleasingly, is he is a combustion engineer, and which is why he wears red. So, and he consults with all sorts of unsavory types. But well, down there they must know a lot about combustion, right? Anyway, sorry. Actually, there has never been a more angelic fellow than Darshan, and he has been at ASU. I think now this is your third year, third, beginning of the third year, and he's there to take part in one of the most difficult exercises in cultural change imaginable, which is changing the culture of engineering. To get it more outward-facing, more facing towards explicit challenges to social well-being, rather than an insular, very kind of disconnected academic pursuit. And it's not that, of course, engineers aren't trained to solve problems, but they're trained to solve any problem that happens to come their way. And we believe that we live in a world of norms and values and ethics, and that there's no such thing as a completely disconnected, dispassionate decision when it comes to applying what you know in the real world. And Darshan's about making that explicit and finding ways to help engineers engage the world more explicitly, productively. So he'll talk about that, and then you'll all talk with him. So thanks for being here.
Great. I would like to start with the premise that engineers have been at the heart of the constant process of changing and creating the future. and that matters deeply to concerns of justice and equity. So many of the problems that we face in society, from climate change to building more bombs and developing war-fighting capabilities, implicates the profession of engineering and implicates what we do as engineers and how we identify ourselves. And it is my goal to embed the ideas of social justice, peace, and environmental protection at the heart of engineering. So what I'd like to share with you today is my lab group's first major project in an effort to address ideas of social justice and peace and environmental protection in engineering, and that is called Project Confluence. Project Confluence is an effort to conduct engineering and science that promotes environmental, climate, and energy justice. And what I mean by those terms simply is centering those who are marginalized and overlooked in concerns related to environmental, energy, and climate issues. So today I'd like to share with you what the motivations of what Project Confluence are, what we're doing, what we're learning, and how we could use your help. I'd like to start with this animation where you see about a 31,000 square mile area at the intersection of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Virginia. And what you see in yellow is the expansion of mountaintop removal over the last 20 years, so from 1985 to about 2015. And we have interviewed 5 different communities that are in this general Appalachia region. And many of them have told us that, you know, they don't want to see their mountains blown up, but they provide jobs, and then they'll, you know, when they take those jobs, it helps them pay the bills. So in this area, so for example, in McDowell and Mingo County on this side of West Virginia, the poverty rate is upwards of 30%. Median incomes are about $25,000. And so they're like, we'll take the jobs and worry about the health risks of mountaintop removal a little bit later. And so these communities for the last several decades have been facing the impacts of mountaintop removal, poor soil quality, worsening water quality, poor air quality. And then you now superimpose on that the expansion of oil and gas and fracking. So before you start interpreting what this crazy map is trying to show, I'll just point out the important things to take away here. So each one of the 42,000 black dots that you see here is some kind of compressor facility or well pad or something that's related to fracking. And that's overlaid on top of a chloropleth map, which you see in the colors, which shows basically a level of air quality. So the redder color you see, the worse the air quality is. These data are EPA National Air Toxics Assessment data. So not only have these communities not addressed the legacies of mountaintop removal, but now you have on top of that the expansion of oil and gas infrastructure and the associated problems that come with that. But what we're seeing is not only fossil fuel policy or energy policy in the United States, we're seeing the impacts of engineering and technological design and the impacts that those have on communities. So technical questions, again, are not only the causes of these sorts of issues, but they're at the heart of trying to address many of these concerns as well. So how might we design off-the-grid photovoltaic systems to provide communities more energy independence? Or what are the robustness of low-cost air pollution sensors that have been coming onto the market? How do they compare according to EPA data, for example? Or how do we take large-scale climate models and somehow dynamically downscale them so that the results of those models are relevant to communities at a local scale? So the answers to these kinds of questions might be relevant to those communities that are struggling with legacies of injustice. And that is what frames the founding research question behind Project Confluence, which is, what are the engineering and scientific resources, tools, or projects that could serve the needs of multiple communities facing environmental, climate, and energy justice issues in the United States? And the research question is driving, from what we can tell, the first nationwide technical needs assessment of energy, environmental, and climate justice groups in the United States. you know, as an engineer, it's, and as an academic, it's easy to go through the academic literature and say, okay, this is where the gap is in the academic literature, and this is where I want to invest my time and resources. But I don't want to make any assumptions about what people actually need. Why don't we just ask people what they need and then set our engineering agenda that way? So this is exactly the approach that we're taking with Project Confluence, is ask the people what they want and somehow try to deliver on that. So overall, our goal is to try to understand what the unmet technical needs are of these community groups across the United States and address them at scale. And in doing so, try to promote a culture of engineering and science that centers the social good, that centers the promotion of social justice and environmental protection. We'd like to address these issues, again, at a structural scale and lower the barriers to entry for all of those people who might be interested in doing this kind of work. And at some fundamental level, try to provide a counterpoint to that quote that's at the top there. So I was talking to one of the leading environmental justice attorneys in California, and he was talking about a community organization called Communities for a Better Environment. And he said that the biggest asset that Communities for a Better Environment has is its technical experts. And CBE is unique. And I believe that CBE should not be unique, right? Everybody should have access to engineering and scientific resources. So how do we do that? Well, we're starting with, as I mentioned, a technical needs assessment, and we're doing that through a two-pronged approach. We're taking surveys and doing interviews, and we're collecting data on 20 different variables here. You don't have to go through what all those variables are. But basically, the survey helps us understand basic information on the organizations, what their goals are, what strategies they might be using to address their needs, whether it's, you know, local education to doing some kind of advocacy with policymakers, so on and so forth. And then the interview then allows us to dive a little bit more into what these groups are actually trying to accomplish and what barriers they've been facing in trying to accomplish what they're hoping to. And also getting them to think about how their needs, if addressed, might also help the needs of other groups that they might know of. So we create linkages between different groups facing similar issues. So understanding these variables gives us a sense of the scale and scope of the needs for collaborative, community-based engineering and scientific work. It provides us detailed information on the ways in which we can address those needs. Here's a map of the groups that we've reached out to and the groups that we've successfully connected with. So we've reached out to about 350 organizations across the United States, or community groups across the United States. We've interviewed and surveyed on the order of 60 of them. We have a list of about another 3,000 groups that we're going to go through. So this gives you a sense of the spread of the organizations, where they're located. We haven't been able to really successfully connect with groups in the plains. So if you have ideas on who to reach out to there, that would be absolutely fantastic. But our goal is to try to get to at least 100 groups by May. We're at about 60 right now, so we have a couple more months to try to achieve that goal. And those 100 groups, hopefully spanning 35 states in the United States. In talking to the different groups, we've figured that there's a few focal areas that these groups have been focusing on. We've categorized them in this way. So things related to the groups focusing on issues of public health, all the way to oil and gas infrastructure, conservation, water pollution, so on and so forth. So you can see here that the total, if you were to add all of these numbers up, is way more than 60. Right? So that's an indicator that these groups have overlapping issues, that they might be talking about these issues in ways that relate to the issues that other groups might have. Just as an example, public health might implicate issues related to air quality concerns that may be caused by industrial facilities and, you know, children breathing in different kinds of toxins, maybe asthma effects, so on and so forth. Oil and gas infrastructure, as I mentioned already, the expansion of fracking in the United States is a good example of that. There are a lot of groups working on clean energy transition. So how do we think about the legacy of fossil fuel infrastructure, and if those jobs go away that support the fossil fuel infrastructure, how do we transition those communities away from that kind of economic dependency? So while some of the groups that we've interviewed have worked with engineers and scientists before, a lot of the groups that we've talked to have not. And in talking to these groups, we've identified a few barriers that they face in engaging with engineers and scientists. And here are some examples here. So the issues that groups have raised go from issues of limited funding all the way to sort of being viewed as token community participants. So many small groups and nonprofits don't have the resources to hire engineers and scientists, right? They cost a lot of money possibly to consult. And at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, you have one set of issues that a community has been dealing with, and now you have another set of issues that a community is dealing with, right? They're starting to wrap their heads around what they're facing because of water pollution issues, and now they have another issue that they're starting to deal with. So the issues that they're dealing with are dynamic, and they really can't keep up to speed with what the issues that they need to be dealing with are. At the same time, engineers and scientists who have worked with, communities that have worked with engineers and scientists have found that the engineers and scientists who they've engaged with just haven't listened to what their issues actually are. So there's a lack of mutual understanding, and that's impeding collaboration, effective collaboration with these community groups. Other groups that we've interviewed have said that the community members that they represent kind of assume that the government is actually going to take care of these issues, right? But it turns out that the local government agency is understaffed, and so the government itself can't keep track of every fracking operation that's happening or every compressor facility that's being put up, right? So there's actually a lack of government capacity. There's another group that we talked to that's focusing on flooding resilience. And they were talking about how they were just kind of handed the plan for the development and then asked for their input after the plan had already been created, right? So there's kind of like a tokenism there. So there's significant barriers to engaging with engineers and scientists. But in talking to these groups, we've also found that there's significant opportunities to engage with these groups. So here's just a very short list of the kinds of things that community groups have asked for. And this comes from a list of literally dozens of different things that community groups could be benefiting from. I've divided them into different terms of projects, so short-term projects, medium-term, long-term. And again, you don't have to read everything that's here, but this is just to give you a sense of the fact that the needs that the groups have identified sort of span a range of level of engagement that may be necessary on the part of engineers and scientists. So, for example, there's a group that we talked about that really was just looking for like an app that signals to them when air quality is poor, right? And that could take a developer a few days to do. It's not really that big a deal, right? There's probably some government data that's coming in real time, and you could develop an ad that scrapes that data and creates an indicator or something and sends a message out, right? Something a little bit more longer term, maybe related to proximity analysis. So there's a group again that's interested in what are the risks of an oil and gas explosion or a leak or something that may happen at a facility that they live around. So that might require some kind of mapping process, some kind of on-site engagement to see whether the facilities are working well or not. And then there are longer-term projects, like one community that we talked to is interested in noise monitoring. So a lot of these facilities, again, they might have compressors or just kind of noisy things that are affecting the quality of life of these communities. And so you might imagine that there might be some kind of baseline monitoring that happens, the setting up of a network of sensors, making sure that those sensors work over time, so on and so forth. So basically the point here is that the needs that we're identifying span a range of levels of engagement on the part of engineers and scientists. But we're noticing through the interview process that a lot of these communities are facing similar issues. They're facing overlapping issues. And so let me give you a sense now of how we can try to craft projects in ways that might address the needs of multiple community groups at the same time. So let's take community A, and let's just say it has a fracking focus. Now this community is interested in environmental impact assessment reviews. They're interested in visualizing publicly available data that might exist from some government agency. And I should say that all of this is actually, these are real data, right? So I'm anonymizing, anonymizing the community group. They're also interested in what the health impacts are of living next to fracking facilities. And they're interested in starting to do baseline monitoring. So before anything happens, what are the base environmental conditions that exist in that locale, so that when the company comes in, they have something to refer back to say, okay, this is possibly what the impact of that community was, right? So from these 4 needs, we can identify maybe 2 or 3 different projects that engineers and scientists can work on to help address those needs. So you can think of an environmental impact assessment review tool that incorporates health-related concerns based on the inputs of community concerns and ties them somehow with federal and state regulations. Somebody can work on creating a data visualization tool that builds on an environmental justice screen, which the EPA has produced, with spatial analysis options and the ability to add different layers of data that the community might be interested in. We might also be able to imagine the creation of an air and water quality monitoring toolkit that incorporates low-cost air pollution sensors, something that may be affordable to the community, and somehow benchmark those sensors with sensors that the EPA might be using, right? Calibrate them in some way. We talked to another community that, instead of having a fracking focus, has a watershed focus. And in talking to them, they kind of express the same needs. Like, oh, hey, we need help with environmental impact assessments. It'd be great if we can figure out what the impacts of pollutants are on our health. And we're also interested in like understanding the baseline quality of the water that's around us, right? Talk to another community that focuses more on public health, and they're interested additionally, on top of all of these other things, the economic costs of fossil fuel infrastructure on their communities. And you can see where this is going, right? We're talking to multiple communities that are expressing some sort of need, and we're able to classify those needs in terms of projects that may address multiple of those needs, right? So here's, again, we're just taking 5 different community groups that we talked to in the Appalachia region who have expressed a certain number of needs, and we can somehow craft projects in ways that might be able to address all of their needs. So just to sort of tie this all together, I showed you at the very beginning an expansion of mountaintop removal at the intersection of Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. So that region is about right here. And I've just placed dots for where the different communities that we've interviewed are. And so they all sort of lie in this Marcellus Shale Appalachia region that you see here. And all of the yellow dots and black dots sort of together represent the 1.2 million part of the 1.2 million frac pads that exist in the United States. But the point really here is that these communities, the needs that these communities have, might be representative of the needs of different communities in the area that we don't have access to, right? So if we can somehow define projects in a way that address these communities' needs, and we share that information, we share the projects that the things that we build, these communities that may be facing similar issues might benefit from those projects as well. So if we take a broad look at the kinds of needs that communities have expressed, we imagine all different kinds of expertise that could be helpful to these communities. So electrical engineering could be super helpful all the way to geographic information systems, mining engineering, aerospace and mechanical engineering. And we feel that the skills that engineers have, ranging from their ability to think about different ways in which to address the problem, to data collection, to experimental design, life cycle assessment, and program management, all of the skills that engineers are kind of trained to have might be beneficial for these communities. And we imagine a range of different ways in which engineers and scientists might be able to engage with those communities, ranging from short-term consultation to longer-term embeddedness, to working with students to take them out into the field and have them address community needs, to designing surveys, co-designing projects, so on and so forth. But many times I feel like even just getting hung up on who's the right kind of engineer to do this kind of work is probably not the right way to think about it. Many times it's just the fact that an engineer can help out in any sort of issue might be the right way to approach it. So it's just that engineers and scientists who may be trained with a certain set of skills, deploying those skills in service of community might be the best approach. Maybe they don't care whether the engineer that they're engaging with is a mining engineer or a chemical engineer, whatever, right? It's just the fact that engineers have skills that can be used to address communities' needs. There are also ways in which the data that we're gathering can be analyzed in ways that might be able to help inform how we make decisions at a bit of a higher level. So as I mentioned earlier, there's about 20 different variables that we're gathering data on. And looking at the relationship between each one of those different variables might give us insight into how we might prioritize R&D funding or science and technology policy. So for example, if we want to think about ways in which to prioritize grant programs or research and development, maybe funding that the Office of Environmental Justice puts out at the EPA, or the Office of Legacy Management at the Department of Energy, we can look at a relationship between the capacity that exists in these community groups, if we're getting information on that, and the technical needs that these groups are expressing. If we look at the relationship between the focal areas and the locations of these community groups, it might give us a sense of how to implement region-specific trainings or workshops that spread knowledge about the kinds of tools or information that we have. So this gives you a sense of ways in which we can take the data, again, and think about how it might shape a higher level decision-making or policy-making or the direction of resources that we have to address these communities' needs. So a few of the next steps that we're taking are engaging engineers and scientists. We started talking to engineering companies in the Phoenix area and just telling them, hey, here's 1,000 different projects that you could work on, right? We had a workshop with the Union of Concerned Scientists a few weeks ago just on the 3rd floor to talk about ways in which we can mobilize 1,000 more engineers and scientists to build off of the work of few existing programs that exist. So American Geophysical Union has its Thriving Earth Exchange program, which engages engineers and scientists to address communities' earth science needs. There's the On-Call Scientist program that AAAS has, which links engineers and scientists and health workers with human rights organizations across the world, right? So there's a lot of good work that's happening. How might we mobilize it? How might we mobilize more engineers and scientists to do this kind of work? We'd like to develop a highly functional online collaboration platform, which basically will show the different needs that communities have and also give communities a sense of the engineers and scientists who have different kinds of skills who might be able to address their needs. We'd like to move from interviewing 100 groups to maybe moving to 500 groups. So that will give us, again, a broader sense of what the justice issues that communities are facing across the US are, but also it might give us a sense of the dynamism of the challenges that they're facing. So if we do this over a longer term, how does that change the picture of what the needs are over the long term? And then we're also thinking about different community workshops that we might have in a few of the EPA regions. We've been talking to the EPA Office of Environmental Justice for this work for a few months now. And they suggested possibly having workshops related to this in EPA regions 3, 4, and 9. So I will end with some questions that we would love your help with. So based off of the data that we're collecting, what kinds of analyses can we do to get a sense of what the scale of these justice issues are? What kinds of resources or networks should we leverage? What kinds of policy mechanisms ought to be deployed and developed to address these issues at scale? And I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay, questions, comments, interventions. I will hand the microphone around. Please identify yourself before.
I'll let you do the, yeah, you do it.
Oh, hi.
Yeah.
I'm Marilyn Merritt. I'm a social scientist. Okay, but my father was an engineer, so I think this is terribly important. But one thing I can't help thinking of is all of this is revolving around how you can mobilize the engineers and the scientists to help these. But what, if anything, are you actually doing to promote infrastructure or organization on the ground? For example, is there anybody going to be promoted in these various communities as the point person, somebody who would be getting actual training perhaps in engineering and science, and who would be seen as this? One thing I see this whole thing as doing is it's repositioning the role of science and engineering. And of course, it used to be the case a couple hundred years ago, any city in the world had a chief engineer. And I don't think we really have that anymore. They're sort of been tucked into other things. So I congratulate you, but I hope you were going to think also of how these people are connecting and to providing infrastructure and building of skills on the ground.
Just a quick response to that is the answer is I don't know and yes. So again, we're trying to talk to community groups that may be fairly well organized. Maybe some of them are not that well organized, but the idea is to, at the very least, identify what the needs are and then figure out what the best mode of engagement might be with those community groups. So the goal eventually is to try to do work that's collaborative, and what that means is that it's not just a one-way transmission of knowledge to these communities, but rather building the capacity within the communities to maybe have them address their needs themselves. And so, the engineer or scientist can go there and work for a year, but then they might leave, right? So what do we leave behind in a way that allows them to address those issues over the long term? So that's something that we're thinking about, but we don't really know how that's going to play out. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning. Patricia Simmons, formerly at NSF in engineering. Found your presentation most interesting. Here's my question. Have you intersected with the citizen science community recently? Because what you're describing is very parallel to the same issues that they're wrestling with. The academies had the report issued a couple of weeks ago about citizen science and the status of the research on citizen science. So there might be some wonderful overlaps that you have, and plugging into that community would address some of your questions, I believe. So have you thought about connecting with any of those folks?
Had some conversations, but haven't really fully thought about what the implications of research in citizen science could mean for what this work is. So we've talked to, maybe Darlene Cavalier, for example. So she runs SciStarter. We've talked to her quite a bit in thinking about how to facilitate collaborations between engineers and scientists and communities, what the platform that we're hoping to build could look like that facilitates that collaboration. So we've had some conversations, but haven't really thought much more than that. But thank you.
Yeah, David Blockstein from the Association for Environmental Studies and Sciences. Thank you. This is a very exciting concept. I want to maybe push a little more with your engineers and scientists. The three-column chart that you posted with, yeah, that one. If you look on your left side with expertise, it's pretty much all technical. If you look on the right side with the scope of engagement, that's almost all social science and what social scientists do. And so I'm wondering, in addition to sort of having engineers connect with communities, isn't this really something that requires interdisciplinary teams, at least involving engineers and social scientists?
Yes. Yes.
So I got a question, Darsh.
Yeah.
To further complexify your life.
Yeah.
So you're opening up the black box of communities and really making a serious effort to understand how those are actually constituted. But you have black box policy. As you've black box policy, and that's going to require every bit as strategic and engaged an approach. And especially when you think about the different funding profiles that are going to be necessary. So what's your long-term strategy there?
That's the secret sauce, Dan. One thing that we've been doing has been to connect with the Office of Environmental Justice at the EPA and the Office of Legacy Management at the Department of Energy. They, for decades now, have been issuing grants to community groups that may be working on environmental or energy justice issues. Most of those grants have been primarily towards technical assistance, and what they mean by that, and what I mean by that, is basically money to help them write grants to the EPA and Department of Energy, right? When we started this, we're collecting data that, interestingly enough, the EPA and Department of Energy have no insight into. So when we showed these data to them, like these are the needs that communities actually have, they're like, oh, we didn't know, right? It's providing a different lens on the kinds of issues that communities are facing. And the idea, again, is to try to build technical capacity to address those needs. And by technical capacity, I'm moving away from grant making and more to say the actual engineering and science to address those needs. And so one thing that we're trying to do is figure out how to embed this at a higher level within the EPA and Department of Energy so that they can strategically, maybe they can create the kinds of programs that may be necessary to address these issues sort of at a bit of a bigger scale.
So let me exercise moderator's prerogative and follow up with a,
yes.
So in some sense, the obvious question here that I bet lots of people were thinking about is that, well, the map that you showed of all those communities happens to also be probably the area of the country that has the most strongest support for the president right now of any area, of any region in the nation, right? Or as strong as any region in the nation. So there's obviously something political going on here, and policy responds to politics. What about the political work that could be done to engage communities to get their members of Congress to change the landscape? I'm not talking about the national political landscape. I'm talking about the landscape vis-a-vis the way the government responds to the needs of these communities. In other words, why aren't there elected representatives all over these issues? Presumably they're not all over these issues because they're not hearing from their constituents about them, right? In other words, isn't there politics to be done there too? So not Dem versus Republican politics, but voices.
So I'd say yes, but to be quite honest, I haven't really been thinking about that in that way. So I guess, and this is perhaps a bit of a naive answer, but I've been encountered with a lot of students, for example, who want to do this kind of work. They just don't know where to go, right? I've also talked to a lot of engineers and scientists, like practicing engineers and scientists who want to do this kind of work and don't know where to go. So what I've been wondering is why don't we just figure out ways in which they can do this kind of work regardless of what the political circumstances are, right? The communities have identified these needs, right? That's clear. Then they come from whatever, Republicans, I don't care who they support or what they do, right? But they've identified these needs. We know engineers and scientists want to do this kind of work. So let's just create a third space in which they can just do this kind of work regardless of what who's in office. Now, that's not to say that there aren't issues with who's going to support this work, right? And where is the money going to come from, and so on.
What laws are going to be, can you litigate under to get action and things like that?
I think that will just sort of reveal itself when the work starts to be done.
Great. Zach Valdez with AGU. I actually work in Thriving Earth Exchange, so we do some similar work. I think this is really great. Your presentation was awesome. One question that I have is how you get communities to sort of communicate that out to each other, right? So here you're saying all these communities, how do we get them to share what they're having?
Yeah.
One way that we're looking at is faith-based communities are really well organized, especially in this region, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So that may be one way to get people of a community that have a similar problem. And to your focus, when you're bringing sort of the politics or the policy aspect of it, half of it is just informing this public, these groups, that they have an issue. So if you can bring science to them and show them like this is something we can study and show you, then they can bring that to their elected leaders and say, hey, we found that our water's contaminated or our air quality is terrible, and that empowers them. So I think this is kind of, you're on the right track. You got to get that first step to give them something to sort of move forward with.
I was actually doing a follow-through on his, since I'm a political scientist and I do think about politics. And once in one of my past lives, I used to do community organizing. These are small communities, am I right? I mean, give me a size.
Well, I mean, we're talking to community groups, and they may be in urban areas, they may be in rural areas.
Pick your red dot. How big is that?
Yes, very small.
Okay.
Very small. Few thousand people, 25,000 people, something like that.
All of these communities, if you want to call them that, urban areas, they have power structures. They have people who make the decisions and generally make them in ways that are beneficial to them. On the one hand, you're talking about helping the marginalized and left out. That generally means, not always, but generally means you're going against what's best for the power structure. You have a political problem or a political challenge. Let me put it that way. Okay. So, I would say if you've got your engineer, are your students insiders or outsiders? Are they local kids or are they outside kids?
So I'd just say in general, there's a lot of enthusiasm on the part of all kinds of engineers and scientists at all levels to do this kind of work.
Okay, but your students, I just wanted to know, are your students living in those communities? Or
oh, so my students are in Arizona.
No, okay. Right? Well, no, you said you have students who want to do this. Okay. The first thing you need to do is analyze that power structure. You need to figure out who benefits and who loses from changing X. Okay, and it may sound obvious, improve the water quality and everyone benefits, but it's not, because it will cost someone money. It might be a corporation, it might not be a corporation, but it might be a corporation who's, shall we say, economically benefiting the power structure. So if you want to get in and do engineering stuff, you first have to do political analysis, which is, he was saying that, but he was looking at Congress, I'm just looking at the local communities. And then you have to figure out a strategy to make those who are in power believe they will benefit if you can change the things you think need to be changed.
So how would you do that in a way where I don't have to do that, right? How, right? No, but the point is that this is all across the country, right? And I'm not going to be responsible for all the stuff that's happening, right? So can you think about a way in which, or what kind of tool or capacity for analysis might we develop that we can share with the broader engineering enterprise to say, okay, if you want to do this kind of work, here are things to think of.
Well,
in doing your analysis
as soon as you
before
start writing it down, you're going to get some opposition. I can assure you that. Well, at your university, you should have some social scientists, because as he said, a lot of what you're doing is social science. And to figure out a strategy for, pick a community, pick your red dot, just as since engineers do test cases, just pick your red dot and find some of your social scientists, whether they be graduates. They might be graduate students, because graduate students are always looking for projects. Might be professors.
Okay.
And I would also talk to the equivalent, and this is West Virginia?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, I talk to the equivalent in your local area, because they don't want to be left out if you're going to go do this. They very much want to be. They don't want Arizona coming into West Virginia, and very much. And they may already have some analysis of this. There may even be some written work on it. I mean, power structure studies have been done for decades. But if I were going into a community and wanting to organize something, I'd start with talking to the people at the top. I'd start with talking as well as the heads of the community organization, just figuring out what the power situation is, and whose self-interest is X versus Y. And if you as an engineer don't want to do that, then find someone who does, which is probably going to be a social scientist, graduate student, or really faculty looking for a project, and make sure they're in contact with whoever is in your local universities. The mayor of Red Dot is much more likely to be responsive to a faculty member from the University of West Virginia than a faculty member from Arizona State University. And but that's, you know, that's what I would do. If you don't want to do it, you need some people who will do it for you, who can find a way to open the door that you want to go through.
I guess I'm just basically posing the question, like, how do we do this at scale, right? If we want to do this all across the country, what kinds of structures do we need to create to make it happen at scale? Yeah.
Hi, Darshan, thank you. So for everyone else, hi, I'm Becca Monsley. I'm a PhD candidate at Arizona State and a fellow at the National Academy of Engineering. And so what really appeals to me about this is sort of the hyper-localized approach to it. The one thing that I've noticed in our conversation is that there seems to be some slippage between community organization and community, because I think we can all agree that not all community organizations are sort of 100% reflective of the needs of the community, especially sort of the most marginalized and most burdened individuals in those communities. And so I wonder if there's any plan to do any work around trying to assess what these community organizations might be missing in terms of their communities as well, because I think most community organizations do take some approach to try to identify the sort of most marginalized, but there is a capacity issue here, as you've mentioned. So.
Yeah. That'd be great, but no. Yeah. Just capacity. Yeah, capacity. I have a capacity too, exactly. That's basically it, yeah.
I have a couple of answers so we don't have to ask. Oh, I'm Leonard Miller. I'm an attorney, and I was lucky enough to have participated in an ASU course that Darshan put together, which was extraordinary and on environment. So I have 3 suggested answers so we don't have to ask Darshan any more questions. One is in terms of how you build this up at scale. Being an attorney and not a public policy person, and knowing the realities of how this country changes policy now, the much maligned trial attorneys have caused a lot of changes if there is the development by engineers of a standard of care. There is no legislation that really changed how asbestos is used. There is no legislation that is going to change how Roundup is used. They're approved by the federal government, but they won't be used because the consequences for using them are terrible. So that's answer number 1. Answer number 2 is to one of those things where you said, how do you progress on this? One concept that you perhaps have thought of is a strike force. As you pointed out, the local communities aren't really that concerned whether it's a mechanical engineer or someone else. It's somebody thinking in terms of engineering. So if you had an ASU-based strike force that would be available to help selected communities for at least an interim period of time, you know, kind of like a CDC kind of group that would go in there and look at it and propose things and then have people coming out. So that's 2. Number 3, 2 areas that you should think about, and it might deal with this geographic thing that you've got. One of them is agriculture. The use of worker protection in agriculture is basically an engineering and science issue. The agricultural workers are subject to all kinds of stresses, and EPA protects many things, but EPA has a hard time developing worker protection. Secondly, the other area that you should be thinking about is repetitive but predictable calamities. There are areas of this country that are wiped out every few years, and then guess what? We rebuild the same areas, and guess what? They're wiped out the next time there's a flood. And with climate change, those floods are going to be more extreme, and those areas are going to be continued to be wiped out. those people, even though there should be political support for them, there really isn't. The way that the laws are put together, you get insurance to rebuild exactly as it was. So if you went to those areas and asked those people for what help they would want, you get away from just these areas and you get more into different populations.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Maurice Kofa. I'm from the Africa Environmental Watch. Thank you for a very excellent presentation. But I wanted to talk a little bit more, or perhaps ask you and the audience regarding the issue of environment. When we talk about environment, we talk about environment in a broader scope, which is global in nature. Specifically, when we talk about environmental justice, it's very much pervasive in Africa. Most of the industrialized countries that go there and do business, they walk away with impunity and leaving Africa with the worst to deal with.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. And so I was wondering, though the concentration here more so is focused on continental USA. My question to you and perhaps the audience is, what is it that ASU has in plan addressing this global issue, particularly Africa, that contribute very or perhaps very minute threat to the environmental problem or the disaster management or climate change issue that they are faced with? Is there anything that ASU has in place to deal with this issue in Africa specifically?
I can't speak to that.
The answer is yes, but Darshan can't. We've asked him to take on a lot, and it turns out the entire world is beyond even his capabilities. But we do have a Global Institute of Sustainability, a School of Sustainability. We have a sustainable engineering program, and so on. So there's lots of international capacity there, which we're trying to build. But that's one thing we haven't asked Darshan to take on. There was a question up front.
Dave, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I think there in your presentation is very good. You mentioned the management, you have the technology, you have the people's need. But what your analysis is really missing is whether they are really benefit the people. Benefit of people and the topic of the people are two different things. Currently, our system is profit over people. Whether it's the NAS, National Academy of Science, or they talk about engineer, they talk about medicine, they talk about health. They are basically profit over people. So if you tell them that they have a project PPP, public-private partnership, they will send you to jail. They handcuff you, shackle you, just like poor people, poverty people is the same. Although your knowledge and your challenge is far superior to what they are doing. So just the same thing as community development. So when we are thinking of data is one of the major critical things. Because a lot of people, and also scientists, they just want the money so they can push all the project, all the data set and grant contract. So put it all in there, all they get is money out. So when you have research, something is meaningless. So I just wonder if you can really have the people really focus on just social justice, real justice. That means you have to have reliability, accountability, and a good research result. And the technology-wise, I think currently we have existing technology you can apply to some other area. You don't need really new invention.
Yeah, that's one of the. Yeah, so the last thing that you said is really interesting. A lot of the things that we found here, this isn't new stuff, right? I mean, it's new in the sense that it's meant for other people and therefore requires different kinds of design parameters. But like, we can do all this stuff, right? So why aren't we doing it? Let's just figure out a way to actually do this in service of people. So I completely agree with you. And I guess the earlier point that we were making is connected to what I forget your name. Did you mention, what's your name? Joe. So what Joe was mentioning about political analysis and like who's losing out if you were to do this kind of work.
David Tomlin, University of Maryland. Yeah. So I guess I see this as on a fundamental level, maybe an education problem, but not necessarily educating the public. So I'm wondering, I mean, I have my own thoughts, but I'm going to let you think about this. And what do you think the role of engineering education is in regards to preparing engineers for doing something like this?
I mean, I think it's a central role, I guess, and I guess one thing that I think about there is just the fact that most of the engineers in the world are not in school. Most of the engineers in the world are out working, right? So how do we somehow get to them? Because I don't know, I feel like we're doing even though we may not be doing the best job in engineering education, we're doing a better and better job over time trying to sensitize engineers to social, political, ecological issues, so on and so forth. But the work contexts that they're encountered with are ones which just quash that, completely quash that. So yes, I guess like fundamentally there needs to be an empowerment of younger engineers or engineers in training to want to do this kind of work and give them the tools that they need to do it. But also, like, how do we get to the millions of engineers and scientists who are out in the working world somehow? Because they actually have the experience that might be necessary to do this work well. So I think when I think about engineering education, it's not only engineers in training, but also just like the workforce at large, and whether there are mechanisms that can be developed that either through continual learning or their licensure or something like that in a way that gets to engineers at all levels, you know? And I don't know.
Can I just follow up with that for a second?
Yeah.
Because, you know, even in a small town of 25,000 people, there will probably be an engineer, right? Or more. And maybe they're wired into the power structure, but they'll still have children who go to school and friends who are experiencing the environmental degradation of the. So is that, and this also gets to the point about if we send our students in, you know, it'll feel more like an invasion than assistance. So is that something that the community organizations help you connect to, and is that explicitly part of the way you're thinking about building capacity?
So right now, the way I'm imagining it is at some level fairly organic, but the idea is we identify needs, we identify engineers and scientists who want to do this kind of work, and they may not be geographically co-located, right? But it may be the case that an engineer is willing to work on a weekend or whatever and do remote work or something like that. So if we can somehow just identify groups of people who want to do this kind of work and develop a platform that allows some kind of collaboration between them, let's just kind of see what happens. At the same time, it may be worth thinking about using other kinds of networks like Rotary clubs or Lions clubs or something like that as a way to get the message out and maybe use that as a framework to build capacity onto or something like that. So I think geographic co-location right now is something I don't know how to really think about that. And apart from just saying, let's just identify all the people who want to do this kind of work and see what emerges from that. But maybe I should be thinking about it differently, and maybe you have I'm sure you have better ideas than I have. So what's missing here?
Okay, I'll speak to what's missing because, Nicole Mogul, colleague of Dr. Tomlin at University of Maryland, in the STS program. And so what's missing is you've got this approach that says, okay, engineers are going to go ahead and start collecting data and trying to give data to people in these communities. And what's missing is that if they don't have political power, it's just a transfer of data from one group who has power to a less powerful group that now has data. And so it's like building the engineers' skills and capacities to see political structures, because that's the way they're going to make a change. And so what I see from an engineering educator's perspective is that this real resistance on the part of engineers and scientists to see their work in a political context.
Yeah. And so can you, what should we do? How do we do, what do we do?
You have to merge thinking about technical problems as political problems. There's no separation between those two things. It would be really fun to be like, okay, here's the engineering problem, Mr. Engineer, go, come back, solve, and the problem will be solved. But the engineer has to fundamentally see a technical problem within a socio-technical system, which that's the framework we use. I mean, political structure or power structures is, builds with that. So there's frameworks for that, but it has to be merged. Like it can't be one and the other.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the idea is that through the process, like we're hoping that this isn't like a colonial kind of engineering, right? That there's some engagement that happens, there's some collaboration that happens, and through that kind of collaboration, exactly what you're talking about is revealed, that this for the people on the ground is actually a political struggle. And that the work that the engineer or scientist might do is part of that political struggle. So the idea is to try to create the kinds of tools that may be necessary to ensure that all people are going into this eyes wide open, because some people might be scared away by doing this kind of work. And that's fine, right? But there are others who might want to do it but don't know how to actually think about it. And so what kinds of resources can we create for those people so that they can actually approach problems in a way where the power dynamics, at least even between the collaborators, are lessened, and also make it evident for the engineers that this is a political struggle. Yeah,
okay, that's, sorry. Again, Marilyn Merritt, and I'm just thinking of all these political problems are very real and legal problems, but I'm also thinking of what do you have that already works? And I come from a small town area. 25,000 is not a small town. You need to be talking about 2,000 to 5,000, maybe upwards of 10, a little bit. And what happens in those places many times is that there are parks and recreation facilities. There are within those small towns, there are city councils and so forth who sometimes work on conservation movements, on creating parks, on doing things that are in essence affecting social good, and they do involve engineering and science. How can we transform this landscape? How can we dig a ditch or not dig a ditch, et cetera, et cetera? And I would just like to suggest that some of those are points of contact where you can see how do people get things done that are similar in those areas and piggyback on those. It's just an idea.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, all right, very quickly, Madhu.
No, we got Purtle here.
Okay. Oh, Purtle.
Sorry. Zach Purtle.
Sorry, man.
So it just seems to me that a central contribution of what you've done here by surveying these community groups and what they view as their challenges, for how to engage with scientific experts, is core to what you're doing here, and that for a lot of these communities, you're really trusting in them to express what their values are, that they don't have access to expertise or to experts on call, which sometimes just even having a scientist who's able to help frame an issue is itself a political act. These groups that are seeking environmental justice, they don't have access to that. And so by trying to find a way to get engineers and scientists to be aware of the low-hanging fruit that's out there, problems that they can spend their discretionary time on, and that therefore, like, they just realize, like, oh, if I work on this community group could have access to it. It's in some ways it's allowing this sort of bottoms up, like, connections of people that could start doing little small political acts of allowing expertise to filter into these problems. So it seemed to me that you were starting to get at that in your last question. I wanted to see if that was tracking.
That's exactly it. That is exactly it. I mean, I don't know if there's more to respond there, but
I think your project is actually, it's a political one to make sure that these community groups have expertise, access to that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think Dan has the answer for this, and I don't know why he's not talking about it, because a long time back he said, science is about human suffering, and if you can find a leader within the community that can say this is why people are suffering, and then you can pull all the resources, all the technology, all the science that can help address that issue. That would be the sort of pulling in all the information. I think that might be more relevant to the community. It would create capacity within the community. And then if the community is completely engaged with the process, the political power would attach itself to that. So that's just a long conversation, maybe a decade ago. But Dan was
good memory.
Are you sure I wasn't talking about graduate students and suffering? Okay, so first of all, thanks for obviously incredibly engaging, inspiring talk.
Thank you.
And
thanks for coming out. Thanks for coming out.
And can you hang around for a bit?
Yeah,
so
I'm
we
around,
invite you all to stay, network, exchange business cards, be DCites, build the community. More impossible questions for Darshan, but even if possible solutions. Finish the coffee and the food, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
We were watching it go way off into like
Yeah.